In the final moments before facing ultimate justice, some of history's most notorious dictators revealed their true nature through their last spoken words. Some begged for mercy, others maintained their delusions of grandeur until the very end, and a few spoke words so chilling they continue to haunt historians decades later. Today, we explore the psychological unraveling of absolute power as we examine the final statements of history's most infamous tyrants. What they said in those last moments tells us more about the human condition under absolute corruption than any biography ever could. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq with an iron fist for over 2 decades, transforming a nation into his personal kingdom of fear. His regime was marked by brutal suppression, chemical attacks on civilians, and the systematic elimination of anyone who dared oppose him. When coalition forces finally captured him in December 2003, hiding in a spider hole like a common fugitive, the mighty dictator had fallen far from his palace throne. Hussein's trial became a spectacle that revealed the depth of his disconnect from reality. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained his innocence and continued to portray himself as Iraq's legitimate leader. He refused to recognize the court's authority, often disrupting sessions with outbursts and theatrical gestures. Even as evidence mounted against him for crimes against humanity, Hussein clung to his manufactured image of heroic leadership. The psychological warfare didn't end with his conviction. Hussein understood the power of martyrdom and carefully crafted his final act. He refused to wear a hood during his execution, demanding to face death as he claimed he had lived, without fear. His executioners, many of whom had suffered under his regime, couldn't resist taunting him in his final moments. As the noose was placed around his neck, Hussein began reciting Islamic prayers. But the moment that truly revealed his mindset came when one of his executioners shouted sectarian insults. Hussein's response was not one of remorse or reflection, but defiance. He maintained his political stance even as the trapdoor prepared to open beneath his feet. His final audible words were religious in nature, but his demeanor remained that of a man who believed history would vindicate him. The execution was secretly recorded, and the footage later leaked, showing a man who had orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of thousands maintaining his composure in the face of his own demise. Hussein died as he had lived, convinced of his own righteousness and completely detached from the suffering he had caused. But Hussein's story pales in comparison to the chilling final moments of another dictator whose words revealed an even more disturbing psychology. Nicolae Ceaușescu ruled Romania for nearly 25 years, transforming what could have been a prosperous nation into a surveillance state where poverty and oppression were the norm for everyone except the ruling elite. His cult of personality reached absurd heights, with mandatory portraits in every home, and children required to sing songs praising his leadership. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Ceaușescu remained convinced that his people loved him. The Romanian Revolution of December 1989 shattered Ceaușescu's delusions within days. As protests erupted across the country, the dictator and his wife, Elena, fled Bucharest by helicopter. Their escape was short-lived. Captured by military forces, they were held in a military facility while the country burned around them. The couple that had lived in luxury while their people starved now found themselves prisoners facing the wrath of an entire nation. The trial that followed was a mockery of due process, but perhaps fitting for a couple who had shown no regard for justice during their rule. Conducted in a small room with minimal formality, it lasted less than 2 hours. Ceaușescu remained defiant throughout, refusing to answer questions and repeatedly demanding to know by what authority he was being tried. He maintained that he was Romania's legitimate leader and that the charges against him were fabricated by foreign enemies. Elena Ceaușescu, often considered the more ruthless of the pair, showed her true character during these final hours. She cursed at their captors and maintained the arrogant demeanor that had made her one of the most hated figures in Romania. Even facing execution, she seemed incapable of understanding why the Romanian people had turned against them. When the death sentence was announced, both Nicolae and Elena were led outside to face a firing squad. In those final moments, Nicolae attempted to sing the Internationale, the communist anthem, perhaps believing that his ideological commitment would somehow save him or ensure his legacy. Elena's final words were a curse directed at those about to execute her, revealing the contempt she held for the Romanian people until her very last breath. The execution was swift but captured the end of an era. The couple who had ruled through fear and oppression died together, never acknowledging the suffering they had caused, or showing any remorse for their actions. Their final words reflected not the wisdom that might come with facing death, but the same delusions and hatred that had defined their rule. Yet even more disturbing were the final moments of a dictator whose last words revealed the true depth of human evil. Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year rule over Libya was characterized by unpredictable brutality, international terrorism, and a bizarre cult of personality that made him one of the most recognizable dictators of the modern era. He styled himself as the brother leader and claimed to represent the will of the Libyan people, while systematically eliminating any opposition to his rule. His Green Book became mandatory reading, and his face adorned buildings across Tripoli. When the Arab Spring reached Libya in 2011, Gaddafi's response was characteristically brutal. He promised to hunt down rebels like rats and cleanse Libya house by house. But the tide turned quickly against him as NATO forces supported the rebel advance. The man who had once commanded fear across North Africa found himself fleeing his own capital, reduced to hiding in drainage pipes and abandoned buildings. Gaddafi's capture in October 2011 was chaotic and violent. Found hiding in a culvert near his hometown of Sirte, he was dragged out by rebel fighters who had finally cornered the elusive dictator. The man who had once threatened to turn the Mediterranean into a Red Sea was now bloodied and disoriented, his trademark golden attire replaced by disheveled clothing. In his final moments, as rebel fighters surrounded him, Gaddafi's psychological state became apparent through his desperate pleas. He seemed genuinely confused about why his own people had turned against him, asking his captors what he had done wrong. This wasn't the calculated defiance of other dictators, but the bewildered desperation of a man whose disconnect from reality had been so complete that he couldn't comprehend his own downfall. The footage of Gaddafi's final moments shows a broken man, far removed from the theatrical dictator who had addressed the United Nations and made grandiose speeches about revolution. His final words reflected not political ideology or defiant bravado, but simple human fear and confusion. He begged for mercy from the very people he had oppressed, seemingly unable to understand that mercy was a concept foreign to his own 42-year rule. His death marked the end of one of Africa's longest ruling dictators, but his final words revealed something perhaps more troubling than political evil: the capacity for complete self-deception that absolute power can create. Gaddafi died not as a martyr for his cause, but as a confused old man who had lost touch with the reality of his own brutality. But the most psychologically revealing final words came from a dictator whose last moments exposed the banality of evil itself. Adolf Eichmann, while not a dictator in the traditional sense, was one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, organizing the logistics that made industrial-scale elimination possible. His capture by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 and subsequent trial in Jerusalem became one of the most significant legal proceedings of the 20th century. Eichmann's demeanor throughout his trial and execution revealed the terrifying ordinariness of absolute evil. During his trial, Eichmann presented himself as a mere bureaucrat who was simply following orders. He claimed no particular hatred for his victims and insisted he was just doing his job efficiently. This portrayal of himself as a cog in the machine rather than its architect became a defining characteristic of his defense. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention his case received and the hatred directed toward him. The trial revealed Eichmann's extraordinary capacity for self-deception. He spoke of his role in organizing deportations as if he were discussing train schedules, showing no emotional connection to the human cost of his actions. When confronted with evidence of his enthusiastic participation in planning meetings, he maintained that he was simply being thorough in his administrative duties. As his execution date approached in May 1962, Eichmann's behavior remained consistent with the persona he had constructed. He showed no signs of remorse or recognition of the magnitude of his crimes. Instead, he seemed focused on how history would remember him, expressing hope that his execution would not overshadow what he considered his administrative achievements. In his final hours, Eichmann was offered the opportunity to speak with religious leaders, but he declined, maintaining that he had no need for spiritual comfort. He spent his time writing letters and organizing his few possessions with the same methodical approach he had brought to organizing deportations decades earlier. When led to his execution, Eichmann's demeanor remained eerily calm and bureaucratic. His final statement was brief and revealed the same emotional detachment that had characterized his entire trial. He spoke of his fate with the resignation of a clerk accepting a transfer to another department, showing no recognition that his actions had destroyed millions of lives. His last words reflected not evil incarnate, but something perhaps more disturbing: the complete absence of empathy that had made the Holocaust possible. The execution was carried out quickly and without ceremony, marking the end of a man whose ordinariness had made him one of history's most effective instruments of genocide. His final words provided no dramatic conclusion or psychological revelation, just the banal efficiency that had defined his approach to mass elimination. Yet another execution would reveal how deeply ideology can corrupt the human spirit. Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, died before he could face formal execution, but his final years in captivity and the circumstances of his death revealed the mindset of a man responsible for one of the 20th century's most devastating genocides. His transformation of Cambodia into an agrarian prison state resulted in the deaths of approximately 2 million people, yet he maintained until his final days that his intentions had been pure. The man who had orchestrated the emptying of Phnom Penh and the systematic elimination of educated Cambodians spent his final years under house arrest in his jungle stronghold. Even as his former allies turned against him and his movement crumbled, Pol Pot continued to believe in the righteousness of his cause. He viewed himself as a patriot who had tried to create a perfect communist society. In interviews conducted shortly before his death in 1998, Pol Pot showed no remorse for the millions who had perished under his rule. Instead, he expressed frustration that the international community and even his former supporters had failed to understand his vision. He maintained that the deaths during his regime were the result of Vietnamese interference and the necessities of war, not deliberate policy. The circumstances surrounding Pol Pot's death remain mysterious, with some suggesting he took his own life rather than face capture by the Cambodian government. His final words, according to those who were with him, reflected not regret for his actions, but concern about how history would judge his motives. He seemed genuinely convinced that future generations would vindicate his methods once they understood his goals. His death deprived the world of a formal trial, but his final statements to journalists and associates revealed a man whose commitment to his ideology had completely overridden his capacity for moral reflection. Unlike other dictators who showed fear or confusion in their final moments, Pol Pot maintained his revolutionary fervor until the end. The tragic irony of his death was that it came just as he was finally facing the possibility of international justice. His final words suggested that he viewed even potential prosecution as another form of foreign interference with Cambodia's destiny, never acknowledging that he had turned his own country into a killing field. But perhaps the most chilling final words came from a dictator who revealed the depths to which nationalism can sink. Slobodan Milošević, the former president of Serbia, died in his cell at The Hague in 2006 before his trial for war crimes could be completed. His death from a heart attack deprived prosecutors of a verdict, but his behavior during years of proceedings and his final communications revealed a man who remained convinced of his righteousness, even as evidence mounted against him for crimes including genocide. The architect of ethnic cleansing campaigns across the former Yugoslavia had transformed from a communist bureaucrat into Europe's most wanted war criminal. His rise to power began with calculated appeals to Serbian nationalism, exploiting historical grievances to consolidate control over Yugoslavia's disintegrating federation. By the time international forces intervened in the Balkan conflicts, Milošević had already overseen campaigns that displaced millions and eliminated hundreds of thousands. Throughout his trial, Milošević conducted his own defense with the skill of a trained lawyer and the passion of a true believer. He portrayed himself as a defender of Serbian interests against international conspiracy, never acknowledging the role he played in the conflicts that tore Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s. His cross-examinations of witnesses were often brilliant legal performances, but but they consistently avoided any recognition of the human cost of the wars he had helped orchestrate. The psychological profile that emerged during his years in custody was that of a man living in parallel realities. In one reality, he was a legitimate head of state who had fought to preserve his country's territorial integrity against foreign-backed separatists. In the other reality, documented extensively by international investigators, he was the mastermind behind systematic campaigns of ethnic cleansing that had shocked the world. Milošević's final months in custody were marked by deteriorating health and increasing isolation, but his correspondence and statements to visitors showed no softening of his positions. He continued to view himself as a political prisoner rather than a war criminal, maintaining that the International Criminal Tribunal was simply a tool of Western powers seeking to punish Serbia for its independence. His letters revealed an obsession with historical vindication that consumed his remaining energy. Prison guards reported that Milošević maintained a disciplined routine even as his health declined. He spent hours each day preparing legal documents and writing what he considered to be historical accounts of the Yugoslav wars. These writings, discovered after his death, showed the same disconnect from reality that had characterized his public statements throughout his trial. His death came suddenly, but letters found in his cell revealed his state of mind in his final weeks. He remained focused on political vindication rather than personal redemption, expressing hope that history would remember him as a patriot who had tried to preserve his country's unity and sovereignty. Even facing the possibility of conviction for genocide, he showed no recognition of the suffering experienced by non-Serbian populations during the wars. The most telling aspect of Milošević's final communications was his continued belief that he could somehow return to political life. He wrote about plans for Serbia's future and his role in rebuilding the country's international reputation. This fantasy seemed to sustain him, even as evidence of his crimes mounted and his health deteriorated beyond hope of recovery. The circumstances of his death sparked conspiracy theories among his supporters, who claimed he had been eliminated to prevent him from exposing international plots against Serbia. These theories reflected the same paranoid nationalism that had characterized his political career and final statements. His sudden death ensured that his final words would be those defiant letters, rather than any courtroom confession or expression of remorse. Medical examinations revealed that Milošević had been taking unauthorized medication, possibly contributing to his fatal heart attack. Some interpreted this as evidence of conscious self-destruction, while others saw it as a desperate attempt to maintain his health long enough to complete his defense. Either way, it demonstrated his determination to control his own narrative until the very end. Milošević died as he had lived politically, convinced that he was the victim of forces beyond his control and that his actions, no matter how destructive, were justified by higher patriotic principles. His final communications revealed a man whose nationalism had become so absolute that it precluded any possibility of moral reflection or personal accountability. Yet even more disturbing was the comfortable exile of a dictator whose final words showed how completely power can corrupt human conscience. Idi Amin, Uganda's notorious dictator, escaped execution by fleeing to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death in 2003. However, his final years and deathbed statements, as reported by those who knew him, revealed a man whose capacity for self-deception remained intact even as he faced his mortality. His 8-year rule had transformed Uganda into a chamber of horrors, with an estimated 300,000 people losing their lives to his paranoid brutality. The man who had once declared himself His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin, VC DSO MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, spent his final decades as just another exile living off Saudi charity. Yet even stripped of his power and titles, Amin's psychological disconnect from reality remained as complete as during his reign of terror. During his exile, Amin lived comfortably in Jeddah, apparently oblivious to the international condemnation that surrounded his name. Visitors to his Saudi residence reported that he spent his time swimming, fishing, and maintaining the same jovial personality that had masked his brutality during his presidency. He seemed genuinely puzzled by suggestions that he should face trial for his actions in Uganda. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Here was a man responsible for some of Africa's worst atrocities, living peacefully, while expressing confusion about why the world viewed him as a monster. His daily routine in exile reflected the same grandiose self-image that had characterized his presidency. Amin continued to dress formally, maintained ceremonial protocols in his interactions with visitors, and spoke as if he were still Uganda's legitimate leader, temporarily absent from his country. Neighbors in Jeddah reported that he would sometimes stand on his balcony, addressing imaginary crowds, apparently reliving speeches from his presidential days. In interviews conducted during his exile, Amin consistently portrayed himself as a misunderstood leader who had tried to modernize Uganda and protect it from foreign interference. He claimed that reports of atrocities during his rule were exaggerated by enemies seeking to discredit his achievements. When confronted with specific evidence of brutalities committed by his forces, he either denied knowledge or claimed they were necessary responses to threats against his government. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Amin to maintain this fantasy were perhaps more disturbing than conscious evil. He seemed to have genuinely rewritten his own history, creating a narrative in which he was Uganda's savior rather than its destroyer. Former associates who visited him in exile reported that Amin would speak passionately about development projects he claimed to have initiated, completely ignoring the economic collapse that had actually occurred during his rule. The most disturbing aspect of Amin's final years was his apparent ability to compartmentalize his past completely. He spoke fondly of his time as Uganda's president, describing elaborate ceremonies and development projects while seeming genuinely unaware of the terror his regime had created. Family members reported that he maintained this cheerful demeanor even as his health declined in his final months. His children, raised in Saudi Arabia, apparently knew little of their father's true history beyond his own sanitized version of events. Medical professionals who treated Amin during his final illness described a patient who maintained his grandiose self-image even while facing mortality. He continued to demand the formal respect he believed was due to a former head of state, and seemed genuinely confused when medical staff treated him as an ordinary patient rather than dignitaries. According to those present during his final illness, Amin's last coherent statements reflected not remorse or fear, but confusion about why he couldn't return to Uganda. He seemed to believe that enough time had passed for his people to welcome him back, showing no understanding that his name had become synonymous with tyranny. His final words reportedly expressed hope that Uganda would someday recognize his contributions to the country. Even on his deathbed, Amin maintained the delusion that history would vindicate his rule. Religious leaders who attended Amin during his final days reported that he showed no signs of spiritual reflection or repentance. Instead, he spoke of his presidency as if it were a successful chapter in Ugandan history that had been misrepresented by hostile forces. His inability to acknowledge the suffering he had caused persisted literally until his final breath. Amin's death in Saudi Arabia meant he never faced formal justice, but his final statements revealed something perhaps more chilling than defiant evil, the complete psychological disconnect that allowed a man responsible for immense suffering to live comfortably with his memories while maintaining a pleasant social facade. His case demonstrated how absolute power can create such complete moral blindness that even facing death cannot penetrate the wall of self-deception. The world's reaction to news of his death was notably muted, reflecting how thoroughly his legacy had been defined by his crimes rather than his own self-perception as a patriotic leader. His final words served as a reminder that some forms of evil are not dramatic or self-aware, but simply the result of complete moral blindness combined with the human capacity for self-justification. However, one dictator's final court appearance provided perhaps the most psychologically revealing moments of all. Ratko Mladić, known as the Butcher of Bosnia, was sentenced to life imprisonment rather than execution, but his capture and final statements during sentencing revealed the mindset of a man who orchestrated some of Europe's worst atrocities since World War II. His role in the Srebrenica massacre and the siege of Sarajevo made him one of the most wanted war criminals in the world, yet his final court appearances showed no recognition of the magnitude of his crimes. The transformation of Mladić from respected Yugoslav army officer to international war criminal represents one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern military history. His military career had begun with promise during Yugoslavia's federal period, but the dissolution of the country unleashed nationalist fervor that would consume his moral compass entirely. By the time he assumed command of Bosnian Serb forces, the professional soldier had become an instrument of ethnic hatred. During his years as a fugitive, Mladić lived under assumed identities in Serbia, reportedly maintaining a comfortable lifestyle while remaining defiant about his actions during the Bosnian War. Intelligence reports suggested he moved frequently between safe houses, protected by a network of supporters who viewed him as a hero rather than a war criminal. His ability to evade capture for 16 years demonstrated the depth of support he retained among certain segments of Serbian society. When finally captured in 2011, he appeared to have aged dramatically, but his core beliefs remained unchanged. He continued to view himself as a defender of Serbian interests rather than a perpetrator of genocide. The physical deterioration was evident. The robust military commander had become a frail, elderly man, but his psychological commitment to his wartime actions remained absolute. Medical examinations revealed significant health problems, yet Mladić showed no interest in using his condition to express remorse or seek forgiveness. Throughout his trial at The Hague, Mladić's behavior alternated between theatrical outbursts and stone-faced silence. He frequently interrupted proceedings, dismissed the court's legitimacy, and maintained that his actions during the war were necessary military operations rather than crimes against humanity. His attitude toward survivors who testified against him showed no empathy or recognition of their suffering. Court observers noted that Mladić seemed particularly agitated when confronted with evidence of civilian casualties, not out of remorse, but apparently due to frustration that military necessities were being questioned. The psychological profile that emerged during the trial revealed a man whose identity had become so intertwined with nationalist ideology that acknowledging his crimes would require dismantling his entire sense of self. Military psychiatrists who observed Mladić noted that he appeared to genuinely believe his own propaganda about defending Serbian people from genocide, even when presented with overwhelming evidence that he had committed genocide against others. The most revealing moments came during victim impact statements, when survivors and family members of those killed in Srebrenica and other atrocities described their experiences. Mladić's reactions ranged from apparent boredom to angry gestures, but never included any sign that he understood the human cost of his decisions. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the hatred directed toward him, as if the suffering of non-Serbian civilians was simply irrelevant to his moral calculations. Court transcripts revealed telling exchanges between Mladić and his defense attorneys, who struggled to convince him to show even tactical remorse that might mitigate his sentence. Mladić reportedly rejected such advice, insisting that expressing regret would dishonor the Serbian soldiers who had served under his command. His loyalty to his subordinates and his cause remained absolute, even as those same subordinates provided testimony that incriminated him further. When given the opportunity to make final statements before sentencing, Mladić used the time to reiterate his belief that he had been defending his people against enemies who sought to destroy the Serbian nation. He expressed no remorse for the thousands of civilians killed under his command, and maintained that history would vindicate his actions. His words reflected the same nationalist fervor that had driven him during the war, unchanged by years of legal proceedings and confrontation with evidence of his crimes. The content of his final statement was particularly striking for its complete absence of acknowledgement that his victims had been innocent civilians rather than enemy combatants. Mladić spoke of military necessity and Serbian survival as if the systematic elimination of Bosniak men and boys at Srebrenica had been a legitimate wartime operation. His inability to distinguish between military targets and civilian populations revealed how thoroughly his thinking had been corrupted by ethnic hatred. His sentencing to life imprisonment was met with the same defiant stance he had maintained throughout the trial. Mladić's final words to the court suggested that he viewed himself as a martyr for Serbian nationalism, rather than a convicted war criminal. His inability to acknowledge the suffering he had caused revealed how completely his worldview had been shaped by ethnic hatred and military loyalty that recognized no moral boundaries. Prison officials reported that Mladić continued to maintain his innocence even after sentencing, spending his time writing what he considered to be historical accounts of the Bosnian War that would vindicate his actions. His final communications from prison reflected the same disconnect from reality that had characterized his trial testimony, an absolute conviction that he had been fighting a just war against enemies of the Serbian people. The contrast between Mladić's self-perception and his international reputation as a war criminal illustrated the dangerous power of ideology to override basic human empathy. His final statement served as a reminder that some of history's worst atrocities have been committed by individuals who genuinely believed they were acting righteously, protected by ideological frameworks that dehumanized their victims so completely that mass murder became psychologically acceptable. His life sentence ensured that his final words would be those defiant court statements, rather than any deathbed confession or expression of remorse. In many ways, this was fitting for a man whose entire career had been built on the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of his victims. The tragedy was not just the thousands of lives he had destroyed, but the complete moral blindness that made such destruction possible while allowing him to maintain his self-image as a protector rather than a destroyer. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of all these cases is how they illuminate the capacity for evil that exists within ordinary human psychology. The final words of history's dictators reveal a disturbing pattern that transcends cultural, ideological, and temporal boundaries. Whether facing firing squads, hanging, or life imprisonment, these individuals who wielded absolute power showed a remarkable consistency in their inability to acknowledge the suffering they had caused or accept responsibility for their actions. From Hussein's religious defiance to Eichmann's bureaucratic detachment, from Ceaușescu's communist anthem to Gaddafi's bewildered confusion, these final moments expose the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary humans to become instruments of mass destruction. The absence of remorse, the persistence of self-justification, and the complete lack of empathy for victims remained constant themes across different eras and ideologies. The psychological patterns that emerge from these final moments are both fascinating and terrifying in their consistency. Each of these individuals had constructed elaborate mental frameworks that allowed them to justify their actions, and these frameworks proved remarkably resistant to collapse even when confronted with death. The human capacity for self-deception appears to be almost unlimited when combined with the corrupting influence of absolute power. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that these were not monsters in any supernatural sense, but human beings whose capacity for moral reasoning had been systematically corrupted by power, ideology, and the gradual erosion of empathy that comes with treating other humans as obstacles to be removed, rather than individuals deserving of basic dignity. Their final words demonstrate how ordinary psychological mechanisms, patriotism, loyalty, ideological commitment, and self-preservation can be twisted into justifications for the most horrific acts imaginable. The transformation of these individuals from whatever they had been before power into instruments of mass destruction follows predictable patterns that historians and psychologists continue to study. The gradual dehumanization of enemies, the construction of elaborate ideological justifications for violence, and the creation of echo chambers that reinforce rather than challenge destructive beliefs, all played roles in creating these final moments of unrepentant defiance. Their final words serve as warnings from history about the dangers of absolute power and the human capacity for self-deception. They remind us that the greatest evils are often committed by those who convince themselves they are acting for noble causes, and that the road to atrocity is paved with ideological certainty and the systematic dehumanization of others. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt identified in Eichmann's case appears in different forms across all these final testimonies. The absence of genuine remorse in these final moments is particularly striking when contrasted with the enormous suffering these individuals caused. Millions of victims never had the opportunity to speak their final words, never had trials or opportunities for defense, never had the chance to justify their existence to hostile audiences. The contrast between the elaborate final statements of dictators and the silent graves of their victims represents one of history's most profound moral inversions. Modern psychology offers insights into how such complete moral blindness becomes possible. The processes of moral disengagement, ideological thinking, and the systematic suppression of empathy that characterize totalitarian movements create individuals who can commit massive atrocities while maintaining positive self-images. These final words provide rare windows into minds that had been completely reshaped by power and ideology. The legacy of these dictators lies not in their final words, but in the millions of voices they silenced. Their executions and imprisonments marked the end of their personal reigns of terror. But the lessons their final moments teach us about human nature and the corruption of power remain relevant for every generation that must guard against the rise of tyranny. Each generation must learn anew how easily moral reasoning can be corrupted and how quickly ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. Understanding what drives individuals to commit such acts and how they justify them to themselves until their final breath is crucial for recognizing and preventing the emergence of similar threats in our own time. The psychological mechanisms revealed in these final words continue to operate in contemporary politics and society, making these historical cases more than mere curiosities from a darker past. The study of these final words also reveals the importance of maintaining institutions that can hold power accountable and preserve space for moral reflection. The complete absence of genuine self-examination in these final moments demonstrates what happens when individuals become completely isolated from moral feedback and surrounded only by those who reinforce their most destructive impulses. The banality of evil that these final words reveal should serve as a permanent reminder of our collective responsibility to protect democratic institutions and human dignity. The ordinariness of these individuals before they gained power suggests that the capacity for such evil exists within normal human psychology, making vigilance against the corruption of power a permanent necessity rather than a historical curiosity. The chilling reality these cases demonstrate is that the human capacity for self-justification appears to be almost unlimited. Even facing death, these individuals maintained elaborate mental constructions that allowed them to view themselves as heroes, martyrs, or victims rather than perpetrators of massive crimes. This psychological phenomenon helps explain how atrocities become possible and why they continue to recur throughout human history, despite our knowledge of their consequences. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.